Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Stories at 7. I'm Miss Teresa, and I'm continuing to read Peter Pan, and tonight we are reading chapters 4 and 5. So let's get to it. Chapter 4, The Birds Leave the Nest. Peter, Wendy said, why did you come to the nursery? To hear the story your mother was telling, Peter replied. Wendy was a bit disappointed to learn that he had not come for her, but she asked, which story was it? It was the story about the lady who lost her glass slipper. But I had to leave and I missed the ending. Well, that's Cinderella, Wendy said. I can tell you how it ends. The prince finds her and they live happily ever after. Peter turned to the window. Wait, where are you going? Wendy asked. Back to Neverland to tell the other boys, Peter replied. Don't go, Wendy begged. I know lots of other stories, even better than that one. Well, then come on, he said, dragging her. We'll fly back together. You can tell the stories to the lost boys. Let go of me, Wendy cried. She was very flattered to be asked, of course, but she couldn't leave her poor mother. Besides, she couldn't fly. I'll teach you, said Peter. Wendy had always wanted to learn how to fly. Think how much the lost boys will love you, Peter continued. You could be a sort of mother to them. You could even tuck them in. None of them have ever been tucked in before. This was too much for Wendy to resist. She did have very strong maternal feelings. Well, what about John and Michael? She asked. If I leave them, they will be lost boys in a way as well. Then they can come. I'll teach them to fly too. At this, the boys jumped out of bed. They had been listening quietly the entire time, not letting on that they were really awake. But at the thought of flying, they could no longer stay still. Suddenly, Peter spun around. Shh, he said. His eyes narrowed. Listen. Do you hear that? Wendy didn't hear anything. Exactly, Peter said. Nana, sensing his presence, had been barking since Peter had entered the nursery. Now she was oddly quiet. There can only be one explanation, John said. She's broken her chain and is running up here. I want to learn how to fly, and Nana's going to ruin everything. Pretend to be sleeping, Peter instructed. Tink and I will hide. And so it was that Liza, the family cook, saw the children resting peacefully when she entered with the very excited Nana. Liza had finally had enough of Nana's barking and thought the best way to ease the dog's mind would be to bring her upstairs and show her that the children were fine. I told you so, she whispered to Nana. They were all safe and sound, silly dog. Nana was still suspicious, but Liza would have no more of it. She dragged Nana downstairs and chained her up again. What else could Nana do? She strained and strained at her chain until it finally broke. Then she ran over to where Mr. and Mrs. Darling were dining and burst into the house, barking for help. Even Mr. Darling realized at once that something must be seriously wrong at home. Thanking their host, he and Mrs. Darling rushed out, but it had been 10 minutes since Nana had been in the nursery, and Peter Pan could do a lot in 10 minutes. You simply think wonderful thoughts, Peter explained, and they lift you up into the air. The children tried and tried, thinking the happiest thoughts they could, but still they could not rise from their beds. Of course, Peter was not telling them the whole truth. No one can fly unless some fairy dust has been blown on them. Tinkerbell was still being uncooperative, but Peter still had dust on his hands from holding her earlier. He blew a bit on each of the children, and wouldn't you know it, they flew. Oh, how they laughed as they sailed clumsily around the room. Watch out, Michael cried as he narrowly missed crashing into his brother by the bathroom. Let's go outside, John said. I'm going to fly for 1,000,000 miles, Michael said. Wendy frowned. It suddenly all seemed a bit too real and risky now that her brothers were involved. But the sly Peter knew how to make her come along. Did I tell you about the mermaids? He said. Mermaids, Wendy breathed. Mermaids were even more exciting than fairies. And pirates, Peter added. Let's go at once, said John. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were almost home, but they were not close enough. From the middle of the street, they gasped as they looked up at the bedroom window. Beyond the curtain, the room was ablaze with light. Inside, they could see 3 little shadows whirling around and around. Not on the floor, but but incredibly in the air. Not 3 figures, but 4. The stars, still watching from above, called out a warning. "Peter, the grown-ups are coming back." There was no time to lose. Peter threw open the window. "Come on," he cried, soaring into the night. John, Michael, and Wendy followed. Still on the street, Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana watched in horror as their 3 little birds left the nest and were gone. Chapter 5. The Long Flight. Second to the right and straight on until morning. Wendy remembered what Peter had said, but it seemed that even birds carrying street maps and consulting them at a windy corner couldn't have found Neverland with those directions. And so Michael and Wendy and John had no choice but to follow Peter and to trust him completely. He led them around in circles, flying past church spires and clock towers and any other tall object that struck his fancy. John and Michael didn't mind. They were having too much fun flying over the ocean, racing between the waves. Wendy, however, was worried. It seemed to her that they had been flying for days now. Was the island called Neverland because they would never land? It certainly seemed like a possibility. She was relieved, at least, that Peter was feeding them, although his way of doing it was rather strange. He would chase birds that had food in their mouths and steal it. The birds would then steal it back, and so it went like this for a while until someone managed to gobble the food down. Worst of all, the children were getting incredibly sleepy. Occasionally, one of them would fall asleep while flying and drop like a heavy stone towards the cruel sea below. It always turned out all right. Either the other children would shout, "Wake up!" or Peter would swoop down at the last minute to save the falling child, but they each came awfully close to the water a few times. One of these days, Wendy thought, Peter might let them fall just for the fun of it, because it would be an interesting sight to see. "Don't make him mad," Wendy whispered to John. "What would we do if he left us?" "We would go back," John said. "We don't know the way." "Well, then we would go on," said John. "We don't know that way either. In fact, we don't know how to stop flying." John thought about this. Wendy was right. Peter had never shown them how to stop. "Well," he said, "worst comes to worst, we could always just keep going. The world is round after all. Eventually we would get back to our bedroom window, don't you think?" Peter was nowhere to be found. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave them occasionally. Easily bored and distracted, he would fly up high to talk to the stars or down low to talk with a mermaid. He always came back, but sometimes he seemed to barely remember them, as if he had already moved on to his next adventure. "I'm Wendy," Wendy had reminded him once when he had flown back and looked at her blankly. "I know that," Peter had said, but she could tell he was lying. Eventually, the children learned how to fall asleep without falling. Peter, however, found this boring, so he would cry out and wake them up anyway, just to see them jump. As at last they reached Neverland, less due to Peter's guidance, it seemed to Wendy, than through sheer luck, or perhaps because the island had been looking for them. "There it is," Peter said. He gestured in the direction the sun was shining, like 100 golden arrows pointing to the island. "Look, there's a coral reef and a tiny cave hut," cried John, "and my lagoon with flying flamingos. And there's a hunchback little old lady, and the turtles laying their eggs, and the sewing gnomes," Michael added, "and my flamingo with flying lagoons." "Hello, Wolfie," Wendy called down to her pet wolf. "Hello, boat." The children also saw and recognized the scary first days at school, trying not to laugh at church, the pop quizzes they hadn't studied for, the tooth fairy money, and the delicious chocolate pudding. It was all so familiar. Peter was a little annoyed with the children for knowing so much about the island. He wanted to be the one who knew everything. Shortly, however, the sun went down and the children got scared. Then Peter felt better because they needed him again. Down below, black shadows grew and strange noises could be heard. Out in the open sky, there were no nightlights or nanas to keep the children safe. The children were on their own. Huddling close to Peter, they flew so low now that their toes occasionally brushed the ocean. Something strange hung in the air. All of them could sense it. "They don't want us to land," Peter said. "Who are they?" Wendy whispered, shuddering. Peter wouldn't say. Instead, he said, "This island is full of pirates, and their captain, Hook, is the biggest pirate of all. The boys had been excited about the pirates, but at the reality of them, Michael began to cry, and even John gulped. Of course, Hook isn't quite as big as he used to be, Peter added, thanks to me. During our last battle, I chopped off his right hand with my sword. Now he has an iron claw instead of fingers. If you meet him, you leave him to me, got it? Yes. Don't say yes. Say aye, aye, sir. Every boy who serves under me has to say that. Aye, aye, sir, John replied. It occurred to John then that Tinker Bell's light might make it easier for the pirates to see them. Tell her to go away at once, Peter, the children cried, but he refused. She gets scared and lonely too, he said. They compromised. John would carry Tink in his hat, which he would hold on his head. This worked for a while until John got tired and Wendy took over. Don't think this changes anything between us, a still jealous Tink clinked, if only for Peter's benefit. Suddenly, the quiet black sky was split in two by a loud boom. The noise echoed through the dark mountains. It's their cannon, John cried. The pirates have fired at us. Is anyone shot? I'm not, Michael said. But wait, where were Peter and Wendy? The wind from the cannon fire had carried Peter far out to sea, and Wendy, with Tink, blew high up into the black sky. Tink wasn't all bad, but fairies are so small that they only have room for one feeling at a time. When she was around Wendy, the jealousy Tink felt could barely fit. Seeing a chance to rid herself of Wendy, Tink gestured for the girl to follow her. What else could Wendy do all alone in the sky? She flew trustingly after the fairy to meet her fate. And that's the end of chapter 5. Thanks so much again for watching. Join me tomorrow night and we'll take care of chapters 6 and 7. Thanks everybody. Good night.